Merci, honoré.
Thank you, Edwin. This has been very interesting. I'm very sorry to tax your language skills, and I had to wear the little necklace of shame for poor language skills. My Spanish and Portuguese aren't working to do this. So thank you again for the invitation, Edwin, and for bringing me here to not just hear myself speak, but get to hear these exciting colleagues. And I think this speech, what I want to do is talk about an area that doesn't get described very much, which is the issue of finance, climate finance. And I want to acknowledge Homa Weekmans from the university here, who has been my postdoc at Brown University in my climate and development lab, and has been a huge asset, has been really transformative to my lab group. And we've been able to do amazing things in the last year and a half now. So we continue to work together, and I think the connection is expanding. So I'm going to take up 4 questions. Why does finance matter for climate justice? What happened at COP21 on finance? What are the recurring fault lines on climate finance between the global north and the global south? And what are the prospects for an equitable outcome? Are we likely to get somewhere better as a result of Paris? So I'm going to start with the climate justice paradox, which is very simple. The least responsible countries on Earth and the least responsible people, those least responsible for climate change, are the most vulnerable and are the ones who are suffering the worst and the first from climate change. So essentially, 3/4, 4/5 of the world didn't really cause this problem, but they're suffering the impacts. And that's why it was so important, as Jacob said, for the issue of adaptation to rise, and that was Kathleen as well, right? To talk about adaptation rising on the agenda at the insistence of the developing world. This is a picture you can barely see from a hurricane that killed 138,000 people in Burma, in Myanmar, in 2008. An example of an extremely vulnerable country. There's many things that were happening there. But the countries that are the most vulnerable are the least developed countries. So the poorest of the earth are the 48 countries that have now gathered together in a negotiating group since about 2001 called the least developed countries. They have about 11% of the world's population. They have historically been responsible for less than 1% of all emissions in the world. And together with the Africa group and the small island states make up almost 100 countries that are, in fact, together at about 1% of emissions and among the most vulnerable in the world. Here's one of many categorizations of vulnerability, an index applied across the world's populations. And vulnerability to climate change is, of course, a combination of where the hurricanes hit, where there's low-lying land, where people are living, and then it's also this sort of social vulnerability, of ability to prepare for climate disasters, to deal with them while they happen, and then to recover. So we did a little analysis in the lab a couple of years ago that was published by the International Institute for Environment and Development in London. And so we looked at the least developed countries, the LDCs, and they are 11% of the world's population. They experience about 21% of the climate-related disasters, so they happen to be in some precarious places on the planet. But they suffer 51% of the deaths related to climate-related disasters. So we're not saying all these happen because of climate change, but these are the kind of disasters that are getting worse, becoming intensified, and happening more often because of climate change. So they are 5 times as likely to die. If you live in an LDC, you're 5 times as likely to die of a climate-related disaster as if you live somewhere else. So what might be needed to make those countries more resilient to climate change? There's, of course, the side of reducing emissions. So these countries need money to reduce their emissions or mitigate. But then there's also to adapt. And I'm sorry, it's kind of washed out here too. But there's been estimates by the World Bank, the Sir Nicholas Stern's review back in 2006, Oxfam, Project Catalyst, and so on, the UNFCCC. And the estimates have gone all the way from $4 billion a year to over $110 billion a year to help these countries adapt to climate change. And as we go on and on in time, these numbers keep getting higher. So in other words, the countries have realized that they need quite a lot to build a safer society. What are we talking about with adaptation? Things like building seawalls around an island that's suffering the rise of sea level, moving water wells away from the coast as salt water intrudes into wells that were used for irrigation or drinking water. Many other things, making shelters for hurricanes, making centers for people to go in cases of heat waves. But there's also, so those are sort of hard adaptation or gray infrastructure. There's also sort of soft adaptation, which is building sort of community networks and support systems to reach out to those poor people or those disadvantaged populations. In my state, in Rhode Island, in the United States, we did some analysis and considered that the most vulnerable people were living in inner city neighborhoods, most of which do not speak English. They almost all speak Spanish or other languages. So they are not going to hear or maybe respond to warnings when a storm is coming or some kind of a heat wave or a disaster. So there's all kinds of issues on the social side of adaptation. I don't want to say it's all concrete. It's, in fact, most of it probably is not. But it is going to be expensive. So this has been an increasing demand among developing countries to pay attention to the finance. So that's the why does finance matter for climate justice? What happened in COP21 on finance? Broadly, you've just heard a lot about COP21, so I don't need to review it all, right? There was multilateralism, it was a big win. There's these national pledges, which you just heard about, the INDCs, which were good and bad, right? They added up to somewhere 2.7 or maybe 3 or 3 point something degrees of warming, but without them we were up about 4. So it's about 1 degree better, right? There's some good things about them, and 191 countries doing anything is a big deal. There's these 5-year ratchet cycle, the pledge cycles. There's the global stock take where we're going to check in. There's the 1.5 degrees in the text as an aspirational goal. Was a big achievement of these same least developed countries and some other, and the small island states and some other countries that created the most vulnerable forum, the MVF, of countries that pushed for that to be in. George Monbiot in The Guardian said nicely that in comparison to what Paris could have been, it was a miracle. By comparison to what it should have been, it was a disaster. That is, we've really not solved this problem at all. It's really not binding. We heard about how it's bottom-up, that countries pledged whatever they wanted to, that there's not really recourse or enforcement. Maybe we can have some discussion with Jacob, maybe has a different perspective on this. Really the most binding part is the transparency mechanism that countries have to report, right, every 5 years. But it's not really clear what happens if countries don't meet their pledges in 5 years, right? And what happens if we don't meet our 2020 or 2025 or 2030 targets that are in our INDCs. So I already talked about the INDCs. In those INDCs, if you add up all the money requests, they add up to, this was just through October of last year, I have not seen an update of this, $3.5 trillion. Countries saying, if we receive more funding, then we can do more, as we heard North Korea and many other countries. Mexico had a big condition, they're called conditional pledges. And then expected, a lot of it was never specified where that money was supposed to come from, but if you say how much it's going to cost to do something, you're probably looking for somebody else to pay for it. So, in other words, most of this is money that countries saw as needing to be raised. I want to switch over here. There was, right before the Paris negotiations, the OECD, right, the club of the rich countries, the wealthy countries, Europe, US, Japan, Australia, etc. And then now Korea, Mexico, and Chile is entering, where else? Who else?
Japan.
Poland, Japan, yeah, so you get the idea. So they put out a report arguing that they were well on their way to meeting the $100 billion goal that was a pledge that was made by all the countries back in Copenhagen in 2009. So I'm going to describe where that pledge came from in a minute. So they're wanting to show that to the developing world that they're being good to their promise, that they promised $100 billion a year, that they're getting there. So this report estimated about $62 billion were delivered in 2014. The Indian government, almost exactly a couple weeks later, released a report which said climate change finance analysis of the recent OECD report, some credible facts needed. So here was the article in the Guardian where the Ministry of Finance said no, in fact, we can only say with certainty that $2 billion is new money that really should be counted as meeting the pledge. So we have on the one hand the OECD saying we're delivering $62 billion, and India, Ministry of Finance, saying no, it's actually 2. 62 or 2? Who are you going to believe? Well, who knows who to believe, right? The truth is somewhere in the middle, it's almost certainly. So we've done a lot of work in my lab, and some other NGOs, Oxfam and others have done work trying to understand what really is happening with that, and I'm going to come back to that soon. There's other language in Paris. One less, you're getting a lot of Paris here. So this is really important language where it was agreed that developed country parties shall provide financial resources to assist developing country parties with respect to both mitigation, adaptation, and a continuation of their existing obligations under the Convention. So I think this is really interesting language. Does this reassure you, if you're a developing country, that countries will be delivering on climate finance? Give me a thumbs up if you say yes, or a thumbs down if you say no. Reassuring or not? Come on. It's late. I'm trying to keep you awake. Okay, I'm getting a lot of downs. What did we see over here? Anything over here? Well, see, actually, I was talking to a Bangladeshi climate finance negotiator yesterday, who is also a fellow in my lab, Mizan Khan. And he said that this was actually seen as a victory by the least developed countries, because it has this word shall. Developed country parties shall provide financial resources, and that for mitigation and adaptation. So they think they can go and, like, as they say in Brazil, cobrar. They're going to make people pay, right? We're going to make you provide the financial resources. So anyway, there's a lot of, a lot of room, though, for wiggle that I think this wasn't reassuring to you all. I'm not sure. So here's the pledge, right, that actually came out in the Paris Agreement, was that the $100 billion from Copenhagen would be continued through 2025. So we will not see an increase, that there will be $100 billion. So this was sort of not seen as a victory for developing countries. And most importantly, that there's not really clear definitions of what counts as climate finance, which is a really long-standing problem. I'm watching my time here. But I'm on to the third question, which is, what are the recurring fault lines on climate finance? And they go all the way back. So here's the original Earth Summit in Stockholm in 1972, right? The UN Conference on Environment, or on, what was it, Development and Environment, yeah. And in it, the developing countries said, don't take our ODA, don't take our foreign assistance money that we need for other things, for health, education, roads, hospitals, and so on, and shift that to environmental issues. I mean, then it was different environmental issues, but the similar issues, that they didn't want the money being siphoned off of ODA. So they said it has to be incremental. We need an Earth increment. And that was what was agreed. In the original UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, agreed in Rio, among the other treaties, it was agreed that financial support would be above and beyond any financial assistance they already provided to the countries. So there was this phrase, new and additional. We did some analysis, I'm not going to spend time on that because the time is short, in a book called Greening Aid, where we found, in fact, only about 4% of the promise was met on what was expected on how much would flow for climate change of the $20 billion a year over the first decade after Rio. And then finance comes up again. In Kyoto it comes up, and there's language, there's the clean development mechanism, which developing countries believed would bring in substantial funding. The Bali Action Plan in 2007 promised improved access to adequate, predictable, and sustainable financial resources. And then Copenhagen, of course, threatened to fail without guaranteed finance. In the first week, the developing countries were threatening to walk out of the negotiations, which made everybody very nervous. And then the actual Copenhagen Accord was agreed in a back room between the leaders of India, South Africa, basing Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, right, and the United States. And this was famously when Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton went around the back rooms of the Bella Center in Copenhagen and found the leaders, and they came up with this whole new text. And that's where they agreed to this promise of $30 billion in fast start finance over these 3 years, and then scaling up to $100 billion jointly mobilized by 2020. And it had a lot of other language that there could include private finance, it could include grants and loans, it was going to be mobilized money, it wouldn't be all public grants. In Cancun, this became sort of the law of the land, and the Copenhagen Agreement, of course, was so contentious it was not really formalized in the UN system. We went back and we saw sort of which countries were meeting their fair shares according to these principles of the convention, of whether who's responsible historically for the problem, and countries' GNP per capita or income. Here's the EU, in case you're looking, 80%, it was meeting about 80% of its fair share. The United States, 63%. We also looked at how much was going to adaptation, because it's much easier actually to fund mitigation because the projects are much bigger. I mean, doing efficiency on a natural gas power plant costs millions of dollars, but doing some of these adaptation projects I described, it's hard to spend a lot of money. And in fact, the total was about 18 to 25% of all the funding in the first years was for adaptation. And it's still the case that it's about 20 to 25%. So adaptation remains really sort of a low part of the funding. One of the big problems is that the whole system is very fragmented. There are over 99 different channels through which climate finance flows. So there's not really a good system for targeting that funding for the places and the people who are the most vulnerable. So if you represent those people, you might be not happy with this fragmented system, especially when there's not really good agreement on what it means, what climate finance means. Last year, the students in my lab, we went through 5,200 projects from the OECD that they had listed as being adaptation. They claimed that it was $10 billion worth of adaptation. I'm really cutting it quickly here. We believe that it was only about $2.3 billion that was really legitimately and rigorously classifiable as adaptation funding. So 3/4 of it was questionable in our sort of study project by project. And Oxfam actually released a report almost at the same time with almost exactly the same results. That's happened now twice with us with Oxfam going through old projects, and it's actually kind of reassuring that we're finding similar things. The University of Zurich also did a study that found that 4/5 of the projects were probably miscategorized. That is, they're existing development projects that are relabeled as climate finance, which is very troubling indeed. So the 62 billion, remember, or the 2 billion, it's not 62, I can tell you that. And I don't think it's 2 either, but I don't think it's 62. So that's just me. So what are the prospects for an equitable outcome in my 1 minute left? There's now, one thing that, oh, I get more. Well, it's okay, I'll be quick. So out of Paris came some language that countries, the decision text, there's the two texts that came out of Paris, the agreement and the decision. The decision sort of describes how the agreement is going to happen. So it said, it calls for the development under the UNFCCC of modalities to account for financial resources provided to developing countries. What are modalities? Well, it means like deciding what counts as climate finance. So procedures, well, there's 3 words, right? Definitions and procedures and stuff like that. Yeah, MPGs. Modalities, procedures, and guidelines, right? Or guidance, one of those. Anyway, so it's how we're going to count climate finance. It's not clear at all from Paris whether the financing will have to be new and additional, that is new stuff. It will be an Earth increment, going back all the way to Stockholm. That phrase kind of slipped out of the Paris Agreement. The NGO community really has been pushing, and many others too, have been pushing for a global carbon tax, right? Or a levy on airline flights, right? That would go towards adaptation to climate change. Or now they're talking about loss and damage of things that can't even be adapted to. Or bunker fuels, that's shipping, the ships out on the ocean, are entirely untaxed in the global system. So putting some kind of a tax that could go to the thing that really shipping and airplane travel affects directly, that is, the lives of people in vulnerable countries. Or then there's this, the Tobin tax, the levy on international transactions. So these keep coming up year after year. The groups have been proposing these, but they're not really described in the Paris text. But there's a great need for funding. And I think really if that language that I put up there that said the developed countries will provide, for mitigation and adaptation needs of developing countries, we're going to have to look at these innovative mechanisms for climate finance. And as I said, there's this liability and compensation issue, or the language that's being used is loss and damage. And we're not supposed to talk about liability and compensation, but it's turning into at least an insurance mechanism to help the most vulnerable people deal with these things that can't even be adapted to. Well, there's lots more to talk about, though. One interesting new thing that happened was that China and other emerging donors gave funding for climate change and may give more in the future. The U.S. gave $3 billion during Fast Start. No. Is that right? Or we pledged that, I think. That was Obama's pledge, right, for the next several years. China pledged $3.1 billion. Just to say, you're not alone anymore, which I think is very interesting. So there's new stuff, and there was a lot of language put in the Paris Agreement to make it possible for those countries to report their climate finance. Just this Monday, a $100 billion roadmap was released by most of the OECD countries, and what it claims is that they are on the way towards meeting the $100 billion goal. It's more cautious than the earlier document that said $62 billion. This time it's pointing out that, in fact, a lot of the money, here's $37 billion from bilateral, which means, the Belgian government or all your aid agencies that are giving funding to for climate finance. But then the multilateral development banks, like the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, are giving a lot. I mean, $30 billion, that's really been the biggest increase. And then they expect that all this money will leverage private funding, which will get them to about $100 billion. And Homa and I have a blog coming out today or tomorrow from brookings.edu, where we say this is better, but it still has a lot of problems. If you're interested, if you are becoming a climate finance geek, like the students in my lab have become. So there's still really a great need, though, and it's acknowledged in the $100 billion roadmap, the need for grant-based adaptation funding, that is, public funding for adaptation. And my last pitch is for transparency mechanisms, and I think really we can do so much better. There are information systems out there that can be applied to climate finance to track each project so that there's trust built on both sides, that the donor countries or contributors know where their funding is going, that the recipient countries are knowing what's actually coming, and then also are able to coordinate that funding, and then the NGOs and local communities can find out what's happening and actually, input their own information through smart or even dumb phones, and with photos and date stamps and real information to see if these projects are happening. So I'm on my last slide. Just returning to the big questions. What does finance matter for climate justice? I think it's kind of like the court of law in America, for example. I don't know how it is here. But you can't really get a corporation to say they're sorry after they cause some damage to you. So what do? You seek damages. You seek financial compensation. And this is part of what's going on, is that developing countries are being damaged, especially the most vulnerable. And what is the currency of the world is funding. And so there is just the compensation and the sense of justice. But then there's just the needs, if we want developing countries to avoid high carbon development, we need to help them avoid building those coal-fired power plants in India, and instead building solar panels and farms and so on. And the same with adaptation. If we want to help them survive well in their places, we need to help them adapt to climate change. So you've heard about the fault lines, the prospects for an equitable future. I think there is prospects. I think this issue is rising on the agenda internationally. I was very glad to hear it was one of your top 3 issues, Jacob, for Marrakesh. So keep your ears out in the next, it starts in 2 weeks, almost 2.5 weeks. Then there'll be 2 weeks of negotiations, so keep your ears out for climate finance. Thank you.